Well, that, of course, was not our usual opening theme. Instead of Respighi, we played, for today only, a bit of Bach. But this is Mostly Music. I am Barclay McMillan, and that Bach prelude was played by our guest on today's program, Glenn Gould. That performance comes from the first of 6 new CBS discs, which will be released in the next few weeks, and which celebrate Glenn Gould's 25th anniversary with that company. During this program, we're going to sample a few of those recordings, and for the balance of today's show, indeed, everything that we do play will be a world broadcast premiere. Well, Glenn, 25 years is a long time for an artist and a record company to stay together.
It sure is.
I assume you're feeling like one of the grand old men these days.
Yes, by George, Barclay, it does make one realize that one is getting on.
But I trust you haven't started living in the past entirely.
Well, let's hope not. But, I did have a rather sobering thought the other day. I suddenly realized that there are only 2 CBS contract artists who have been with the label longer than I have.
Really?
Yep.
Well, now, don't tell me. Let me guess.
Oh, you like guessing games too, do you?
Oh, certainly. No day is complete without a good round of 20 questions, as far as I'm concerned.
Terrific. I couldn't agree more, but you're not going to need 20 for this one.
Well, let's see now. Contract artists, you say?
Mm-hmm.
Leonard Bernstein's got to be one of them, surely.
No, actually, he is not. He came to CBS a year or 2 later when he took over the New York Philharmonic.
Well, Isaac Stern, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And the other one?
Well, let's see. Ormandy went to RCA a few years ago. Kostelanetz died last year. Oh, Rudolf Serkin.
Excellent, sir. You are now 2 for 2.
Well, if I do say so myself, I did rather well. And thanks for the workout.
You certainly did, and happy to oblige anytime.
Good enough. Glenn, the fact that you've stayed at CBS for a quarter of a century suggests that you've been happy there.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, one hears all sorts of stories about relationships between record companies and their artists, and most of them involve horrendous battles over the question of what gets recorded and when and by whom.
Right.
Would it be terribly indiscreet to ask whether you've ever had to engage in that sort of corporate warfare?
Well, I think it would be very indiscreet if I'd had to, Barclay, and in that case I probably would not be inclined to answer at all, but it hasn't happened in my case, actually, and that's one of the most remarkable things about that relationship, I think. Oh, there have been times when various executives lobbied for repertoire that I wasn't inclined to record. There was a period about, I think, 10 years back when they were determined that I was going to make a Chopin record for whatever perverse reason, but I just said no way, and it was all resolved in a very friendly fashion. In fact, I can only think of one occasion when they mounted a modest sort of argument against a work that I was really determined to record. You want to guess which one that was?
Well, I'd love to, but since you've recorded more than 80 albums and many hundreds of individual works, and since this program is called Mostly Music rather than Mostly Guessing Games, I think I'd better pass.
Well, okay, I'll give it to you for free then. Are you ready now? It was the Goldberg Variations.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. 25 years ago, they didn't think that was such a great idea at all. And looking back, their arguments were by no means illogical from where they sat. I mean, first of all, in those days, that piece was the private preserve of people like von der Landowska or Rolf Kirkpatrick, maybe. Mm-hmm. And here was this whippersnapper who was 22, who never made a commercial recording before, who had played the Goldberg Variations, I think exactly twice at that time, once in a concert in Toronto and once on CBC Radio, actually, and who announced that he wanted to use it as the vehicle for a recording debut, so you could see their point of view. But the argument, if you want to call it that, went something like this. It took place with an executive who has long since left the company, but I think maybe we should grant him anonymity anyway. He said, what do you want to record first? And I said, the Goldberg Variations. And he said, well, my goodness, now, for a young chap like yourself, don't you think the 2- and 3-part inventions would be a much safer work to start with? And I said, no, I don't, actually. And he said, you really don't, eh? Well, all right, let's take a chance on the Goldberg. And that is the closest thing to obstruction that I've ever encountered at CBS.
Well, that's remarkable.
Yes, it is.
But your mention of the Goldberg Variations brings up the whole question of your identification with the music of Bach. We began this program with a very brief excerpt from your new album of Preludes, Fugues, and Fuguettas by Bach. But I'm intrigued by the fact that on one of the other releases scheduled for next month, you include music by a contemporary of Bach's that you've not recorded before, Domenico Scarlatti.
That's right, yeah.
And I must say, the album in which it appears is certainly a mixed bag, because in addition to Scarlatti, there's some CPE Bach and some Richard Strauss and some Scriabin, and your own choral piece, So You Want to Write a Fugue, and a bit of the Beethoven Pastoral Symphony in the Liszt transcription.
Well, yes, it's a real compote. The only common denominator of the solo performances in that particular disc is that I think they all relate to projects which, for one reason or another, never got finished.
Well, I want to hear the Scarlatti first off, because I've never heard you play any of his sonatas, and I've always been surprised that you haven't, in fact, made a Scarlatti album, or albums for that matter.
Well, way back in my early teens, I went through a phase, as I think many kids do, when I often began my student concert with a group of Scarlatti. Horowitz used to do that in those days, and I think probably he had some influence on the kids of my generation. But after I turned pro, so to speak, I just put away childish things forever and never again played Scarlatti in a concert. But in the late 60s, CBS asked me to make a Scarlatti album, and I agreed. I thought it would be quite a nice change from the Bach that we'd been doing at that time. But I devoted exactly one session to it, a session that yielded the 3 sonatas which are on this disc. And then I just got bored with the project and never went back to it.
How come?
Well, I guess for me, Barclay, a little Scarlatti goes a long way. There's no question, that it's immensely charming music. It's the music of a man who had an incomparable sense of what a keyboard instrument could do. I mean, I don't think anybody, except maybe Scriabin and possibly Chopin, has ever had anything like an equal flair in that regard. And in Scarlatti's case, it's the more remarkable, really, because he wrote for the harpsichord, and yet every one of his gimmicks, every one of his tricks works perfectly on the modern piano, all the cross-hand effects and the repeated note figurations and so forth. He knew precisely in which register of the instrument those devices would work. Everything just comes off exactly, one has to presume, as he wanted it to. And it's not just gimmicks either. He had a great melodic flair, certainly. He seemed to never run out of those marvelously quirky themes that are oddly memorable, in a way that Bach's themes quite often are not. And he had a fabulous sense of harmonic pace. He knew exactly when to insert a secondary dominant or whatever and move the action along to the next harmonic plateau. He had all of those things.
And as you list them, I begin to see a butt flashing in neon lights somewhere down the road.
Well, yes. The but is that, for me anyway, there's no real emotional center to this music. It just skates brilliantly across the surface. It's wonderfully witty and diverting and so on, but it isn't really, I guess, compassionate, or something very like it is the word I'm looking for.
Compassionate?
Yeah.
Well, that's a lot to ask of a little 3-minute harpsichord movement.
Yes, it is, but it's what we do ask and do get from a little Bach invention or prelude or fuguette or whatever, most of the time anyway. I guess the bottom line is that for me there's more spiritual sustenance in a couple of minutes of Bach than in all 600-odd Scarlatti sonatas.
Well, I don't know about all 600, but I want to hear 3 of them right now.
Okay, you are about to audit my entire professional contact with the works of Domenico Scarlatti.
3 sonatas in D major, D minor, and G major, respectively, by Domenico Scarlatti, played by our guest on Mostly Music, Glenn Gould. And I'm sorry, Glenn, but I still like Scarlatti, and I still think you should have finished that album.
Well, you're probably right. CBS thought so too, actually. But before we leave the subject altogether, may I suggest that we play just a little bit of this sonata by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, which follows after the Scarlatti on this particular disc. Philipp Emanuel is not exactly one of my favorite composers, and he certainly does not wash away the worldly grime of Scarlatti the way his old
come
man
on
does.
now. That's unfair to both composers.
Yeah, well, I'm reaching for an image, so just scratch all that if you want it. But what I'm trying to say is that Philipp Emanuel, in this particular sonata, which was written while Scarlatti was still active, actually, deals with essentially the same vocabulary that Scarlatti employs, the same harmonic vocabulary anyway. He doesn't have the same vocabulary of sleight of hand illusions and keyboard tricks up his sleeve, but he deals with that vocabulary in a manner that is so much more thoughtful and, I'd say compassionate applies there too. Why don't we play the second movement of that sonata for a quick comparison, maybe?
Sure.
Now, I think that's gorgeous stuff.
It is lovely. But after we get off the air, I'm going to convince you that there's more to Scarlatti than you think.
You're certainly welcome to try, sir.
One of the things that intrigues me about your recording career is that one has the impression somehow that because you've recorded so much Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, and in the 20th century repertoire so much Hindemith and Schoenberg and so on, that you just skip over everything in between, that you bypass the Romantics and the post-Romantics altogether. But I took a look at your discography the other day, and that impression is really not quite accurate, because you've recorded Grieg and Bizet and Brahms and Sibelius and Richard Strauss, and even your own transcriptions of some of the Wagner war horses, for that matter.
Yeah, that's right, but I think there is a very large grain of truth in that impression, nonetheless, Barclay. All of the composers you've mentioned relate to the latter half of the 19th century, primarily, and for me, the first half of that century, excluding Beethoven, of course, is really a washout, at least as far as piano repertoire is concerned.
Well, that takes in the core of the piano recital repertoire. I mean, Chopin and Schubert and Schumann and Liszt and Mendelssohn.
Well, for Mendelssohn, I've got to make a little bit of an exception, because although I find almost all his piano music a waste of time, I adore the orchestral repertoire. I get very moved by things like Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage or something. And as a matter of fact, I once confessed that I'm the only person I know who'd rather listen to St. Paul than to the Missa Solemnis.
That's heresy.
Yeah, well, there's no accounting for taste, you know. But frankly, if I tried to explain why I feel as I do about the piano repertoire of that period, we'd simply get back into a 19th century version of our Scarlatti argument, I'm afraid.
Well, we can't afford to do that, because this program would then have to be renamed Mostly Talk.
That's what I figured. So let me just say that everything that I said about Scarlatti goes in spades with regard to the keyboard works of the composers we just mentioned. No, come to think of it, not just the keyboard works. Let's make it the solo instrumental works. After all, you know, the Paganini things and all sorts of similar schlock came out of the same period. I find the music full of empty gestures, full of theatrical figurations. Even in the relatively contemplative moments, it has a worldly quality, a hedonistic quality that just simply turns me off. But the later Romantics, the Wagnerians particularly, now that's another story altogether. I am as passionate a Wagnerian as you're likely to turn up this side of Bayreuth.
Really?
Oh, yes. And so when I did transcribe the Wagner party pieces, the Rhine Journey and the Meistersinger Prelude and so on, a few years back, that really was an act of love. Not that those pieces needed any help from me. I certainly don't think they need any transcriptions at all. It's just that I wanted to have something of Wagner's to play on the piano, because Wagner, like so many of the late Romantics, either didn't write for the piano or didn't know how to write for the piano. I think in his case it was probably the latter.
Well, look, hold on. You seem to be saying two different things here. On the one hand, you object to Chopin or Schumann or Paganini or Liszt because, in your opinion, they exploit their instruments. On the other hand, you lament the fact that Wagner didn't know how to use the piano's resources properly.
Yeah, well, that's true, but I think there's a big difference, Barclay, between proper use and exploitation. I don't think that anyone would claim that Bach, for example, wrote exploitatively for the keyboard, except maybe in the earliest pieces like the toccatas or something of the sort. And on the other hand, there's no greater joy, for me anyway, than playing the art of fugue, you know, on the piano, despite the fact that it has no specific instrumental designation at all. You know, it just works on the piano. It works on the organ, it works for a string quartet, it works, I heard it once work for a saxophone quartet, it works for the swingle singers, as we know. It works for any combination you can think of. It's sort of a neutered piece from an instrumental standpoint. And what it comes down to, I think, is that, in my view anyway, and in contradistinction, I admit, to just about every other opinion available, the piano should be treated as a contrapuntal instrument. I think it works best when it's given contrapuntal material, and least well when it's treated in a melody-oriented fashion, the way it was treated by the early Romantics, particularly.
Well, that certainly does fly in the face of all conventional wisdom.
Yes, it does, and I confess that there is a built-in bias there in a way, because I happen to be very little interested in music that does not offer a contrapuntal design. I don't mean counterpoint, by the way, in the sense of some sort of perpetual fugue or something like that. But for me, music only really gets to be interesting when it has a totally integrated use of theme and harmony, of vertical and horizontal space, if you like. And that is not a description, I think, that one could apply to Chopin or Schubert or Schumann. But it is a description that fits Wagner in all of the later works. It certainly fits Richard Strauss.
How about Scriabin? How does it fit him?
Well, I guess for me, as for many other people, the jury is still out on Scriabin in some ways. I find him fascinating, obviously. Who cannot? He's one of the most demonically imaginative composers who ever lived. He's possessed in every sense of the word. As far as what we were talking about before, the contrapuntal thing is concerned, he is very preoccupied in his later years in a very special way with a vertical-horizontal mix. In fact, that's really part of what, his famous magic chord, so-called, was all about. It gave him the opportunity to have a harmonic formula from which he could extract thematic ideas.
Or vice versa.
Exactly. It's not unlike, in fact, what Schoenberg tried to do in the early 12-tone years, really, to make chords and themes out of the same very restricted interval possibilities. But in Scriabin's case, it's a more consonant version of that integration because 5 of the 6 tones in the magic chord are derived from the whole tone scale.
Well, in your anniversary album, you include 2 Scriabin preludes, Opus 57.
Yeah, they're marvelous little pieces. They were written just before the time when Scriabin began to use the magic chord obsessively, if you like. As far as I can remember, the first piece exclusively based on it was Opus 58, and this is 57. So in this work, one finds Scriabin poised right on the brink. The magic chord filters through the harmonic haze from time to time. It's funny, Barclay, have you ever noticed when you talk about Scriabin, you always get carried away with language like that, harmonic haze?
Well, probably because Scriabin himself got carried away with language like that, don't you think?
I'm sure. I think that's absolutely true. But anyway, now how am I going to work my way out of this image? In the end, the harmonic haze lifts and the second prelude puts safely into port in C major. How's that for landing on my feet?
That's not called landing on your feet, Glenn. That's called jumping overboard without a life preserver. And the only way to rescue you is to play the pieces.
You may be right.
2 preludes, Opus 57, entitled Désir and Caresse dansée, by Alexander Scriabin, as played on a forthcoming CBS release by Glenn Gould. Glenn, I think one of the most intriguing items among these new releases is a performance that I gather is by no means new, the Ophelia Lieder by Richard Strauss, with Elisabeth Schwarzkopf as soloist.
Indeed.
Now, over the years at CBS, there's been some pretty imaginative casting in some of your collaborative enterprises. You've worked with some fascinating characters, Leopold Stokowski, for example, in the Beethoven Emperor Concerto.
That's right. How about Claude Rains? Wouldn't he qualify?
I forgot about him. He certainly would. And that, again, of course, was Strauss repertoire.
Enoch Arden, yeah.
Right, the Strauss setting of the Tennyson melodrama. But those records, as far as I can remember, were released more or less at the time they were made.
That's right, yeah.
And yet here's one of the most intriguing collaborations you've ever been involved with, and it was done when?
It was recorded in January 1966.
Right, so it appears in the marketplace almost exactly 15 years after it was recorded.
That's right, yeah.
Why?
Barclay, I can't tell you. I mean, I can tell you, but not on national radio. I can't, I'm afraid. Let's see, what can I say about it? What I can say, I guess, is that there were Byzantine complications that stood in the way of this performance ever being released, and I'm just very, very happy that it was finally allowed to see the light of day, no matter how many years after the fact, because in my opinion, it's one of the most remarkable vocal interpretations I've ever heard of anything by anybody. I'm a little bit prejudiced, of course, not because I was involved, but because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Schwarzkopf fan, always have been. And although I've heard this performance many, many, many times since I edited it a few months back, I still get shivers up my spine with every replay, I mean, here is a lady who was no longer young when she recorded this. In fact, she didn't make too many recordings thereafter. And who, without sacrificing any of her natural tonal inflections, which are among the vocal glories of the age as far as I'm concerned, turned herself for the occasion into a teenager, into Ophelia. It's spooky. It really is. It's the most incredible kind of transformation. I can tell you one other thing about this recording. I think Schwarzkopf had never sung the Ophelia Lieder before, and it was done without any rehearsal whatsoever.
What? Come on now.
Nope. At the time the recording was made, she was incredibly busy with a production of, I think it was Don Giovanni at the Metropolitan Opera, and our sessions were sandwiched in between her rehearsals at the Met, so take one of each of the songs was, in fact, a rehearsal. The producer, Paul Myers, and I decided that the mics really ought to be left on from the moment we walked into the studio virtually, just in case we got something of value in the first takes.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I assume there are no take ones involved in the final project.
I don't believe there are. I do recall there's a take 23 quite prominently on display in one of the songs.
Well, you can't leave us hanging there. You've got to tell us which one.
I do, well, okay, it's the second one.
Well, we've got to hear this now.
Right, but can I take just a moment to say something about the songs themselves?
Sure.
Well, there is, as you know, a school of thought which holds that Strauss wrote himself out someplace around the time of Electra or Rosenkavalier.
Well, I know you don't subscribe to that, because I recall that Mostly Music broadcast the premiere of your Strauss documentary, The Bourgeois Hero, a couple of years ago.
Yes, right.
And it certainly served as a very eloquent refutation of that view.
Well, I do think there's a lot of evidence for the fact that Strauss went through some sort of midlife crisis, if you like, around the time of the First World War, and that the operas, particularly the operas, which followed Electra and Rosenkavalier, works like Ariadne and Frau Schatten and so on, are not up to the standards of Salome or Electra. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But at the end of his life, as we all know, he had that extraordinary Indian summer, out of which came the subtlest of all the operas, in my view, Capriccio, the most moving of all the orchestral works, I think, Metamorphosen and so on. But long before he got to that point, during the period when he was having a very hard time operatically, when Hofmannsthal was urging him on toward ever more mystically symbolic enterprises, which didn't really fit at all with Strauss' very direct, very bourgeois, if you like, way of looking at the world. Even during that time, he produced, I think, the most interesting and underestimated, I must say, of the tone poem-like works, the Alpine Symphony. And he also produced the greatest leader of his life, including this miniature cycle. If you compare these Ophelia songs with the most famous of the early leader, Morgan or Cecily or Ruhemine Zale, whatever you like, you find that those songs, charming as they are, take on easy targets, conventional love stories and so on, and rely on conventional musical formulas in the process. But these songs, the Ophelia songs, take on no less complicated a subject than schizophrenia. And the musical materials are in every way up to that really rather incredible task. In the last song, for example, Strauss vacillates between the keys of E-flat minor and A major, and later on between A-flat minor and D major, keys which are separated by the most ambivalent of intervals, the tritone, and he does it in order to describe the manic-depressive aspects of Ophelia's breakdown,
That's fascinating.
So what we have here is a record, old as it is, pre-Dobie and all of that, which combines my favorite songs by one of my favorite composers with just about the most spellbinding vocal dramatic performance I've ever heard. I guess it's fairly obvious that I'm rather high on the product.
Well, one does get that impression. Let's hear it.
Right.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But I think in case anyone's just joined us, I should mention that we've been playing and talking about the Ophelia Lieder by Richard Strauss. And we've been listening to them in a performance which will be released next month, but which is already a historical item in a sense. A performance recorded 15 years ago by Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and our guest on Mostly Music today, Glenn Gould. Glenn, during the last quarter century, in addition to making a lot of recordings, you've made a lot of comments about the process of recording. You've written extensively about it, you've made radio documentaries about it, and so on. And I've always been struck by the fact that even when you're dealing with what one might think of as purely technical matters, aspects of splicing or multi-track perspective, whatever, you've always managed to insert a commercial, a sort of moral lesson into your talk or your script or whatever it happens to be.
Well, yeah, I think I have to plead guilty to that, partly.
Well, it almost seems as though recording has a sort of metaphorical significance for you, that it stands for a way of life that is much more important to you than the process of recording per se. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do indeed, Barclay, and you're absolutely right.
Well, your own way of life obviously changed a great deal because of recording.
Sure.
You haven't given concerts in over 16 years. Your musical activities are entirely bound up with the electronic media.
That's right,
And one has the impression that what you value most about recording is that it allows you to be, I don't know exactly what word to use here, to be invisible in a sense, to enjoy a completely detached relationship with your audience. Is that a fair comment?
Oh, absolutely. I think the only thing I'd want to add is that while that relationship may be very detached in a social sense, it is also the closest relationship, the most immediate relationship that one can have with the listener in a purely musical sense,
Well, what would have happened to you if recording had never existed, or had existed only in a very primitive way? If you'd been born 50 years early, for example, would you have gone on giving concerts, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I've often wondered about that, actually, and I think the answer really depends on how much backbone my pre-incarnated alter ego might have had, but I can't imagine that he, whatever, would have stayed active in a way of life that was so totally foreign to to his, its nature, you know.
Well, when you look back now over the last 25 years, do you see a progression in terms of the way in which this attitude has affected your work?
Yeah, I do. Matter of fact, I had occasion quite recently to listen to a lot of the early recordings in a rather concentrated way, and I was astonished really by how performance-oriented many of them really were. For one thing, in the early recordings, there's more of an element of, in quotation marks, pianism, and I do use that word in a pejorative sense, than I would like, and than I would have thought was present. You know, from the earliest days, I recognized that recording was the medium I wanted to be involved with, but it's quite clear, nevertheless, in those early discs that these are performances by someone who was still giving concerts.
Yeah.
For one thing, there's an extraordinary casualness about the recording method. Ridiculous, silly little things that could so easily have been fixed on the spot were just often let go, you know. It would seem as though I was perpetually rushing to some airport or other and just didn't have time to assess the takes or something. And this is an attitude that many concert performers do have when they go into the studio. They bring all the one time only straight through to the last note performance traditions into the studio with them. But I didn't realize that I had it in those days to that extent, that I was contaminated by the concert experience that much. I just didn't know that about myself, you know.
So then did all of this change instantly once you'd stopped giving concerts?
Instantly, no. I think the first records that really reflect a total concentration, a total respect for the medium were done about 2 years later, around the time that Schwarzkopf recording was made. And it just happens that that was the period of my life in which I began to do all my own editing, and through that experience to become aware of exactly what could be done and should be done with the medium, you know.
Well, I notice in the credits on these new recordings that you're doing your own production as well.
That's right, but I should quickly add that what I just said is not a reflection on any of the producers who worked with me in those early days. It's a reflection on me, and just that, and on the kind of attitudes that I'd picked up unwittingly in the concert hall, you know. I can even give you some statistics for that progression, if you like. I remember that when that Richard Strauss recording was made, Madame Schwarzkopf said to me before we began the first session, she said, "You know, I work very slowly. I never plan to record more than 3 minutes of material per hour in the studio." And I can remember thinking to myself at the time, my goodness, that is incredibly slow. That is just so slow. Because in those days, I was routinely knocking off 6 or 7 minutes of material per hour in my own sessions, you know. But over the last decade, I watched my per hour rate decline to a point where I'm slower than she was. I now very rarely average more than 2 minutes for any given hour in the studio.
Well, that's incredible. That's a recording ratio of 30 to 1.
No, it isn't actually, although I'd have no objections if it were. No, it's a ratio of something like maybe 4 or 5 to 1, because the related statistic, which I should have given you, is that in any given hour, I sit at the piano for not more than about 8 or 9 minutes.
It can't take you 50 minutes to listen to a playback.
Oh, it certainly does, because I listen to playbacks, plural. I listen again and again and again to the same take, if it's a good one, if it has possibilities, or I go back and forth over alternate takes, trying to decide how they can be improved, how they can be combined, you know, in certain instances, what sort of inserts will work for them, and so forth and so on. I admit that there's the odd coffee break mixed in there, perhaps.
And the odd round of 20 questions with the engineers, I bet.
You got it. But nevertheless, it's a very different sort of approach than I would have taken 20 years ago, say, when I'd spend most of the time at the piano and just casually check out the more promising takes before leaving for the airport and hope for the best.
You've always been extraordinarily forthcoming about the whole business of editing, of splicing. You've written articles about how many splices could be found in a given performance of yours.
Oh, sure.
Even in the course of this broadcast, you've dropped the number 23 on us with respect to the takes in one of the Strauss songs. And there's no other artist, as far as I know, who does this. As a matter of fact, many performers claim that they use no editing at all.
Nobody here but us straight-through takes, right?
Exactly.
Well, I feel compelled to do it, Barclay, I must say. A sort of missionary zeal comes over me when I'm having a conversation like this about recording. I feel compelled to say to people, look, this is a very special art with very special criteria, and if you want it to really influence your lives, as it can do, then you must respect those criteria. Now, the only statistics I have at my disposal are my own, so I use them. But per se, I can't think of anything less important than whether Elizabeth Schwarzkopf and I took 1 take or 23 takes to get what we got in that particular song. What is important, terribly important, I think, is that the process, in all its complexity, has to be accepted. We have to completely eradicate this notion that the good recordings are picture postcards of a concert, that they're straight through, that they're honest, that they're faithful replicas of what human beings do, and that all the others are full of tricks and snares and deceptions. We have to get rid of that idea first, and then I think we can put all the statistics aside forever, because the process of recording is about what happens when you stand outside of time and place. It's about what happens when you bypass the momentary in favor of the permanent, when you try to eliminate rather than to perpetuate human error, you know?
Well, Glenn, the one thing we can't eliminate is the clock. I want to end this program with one of the 4 early Beethoven sonatas which are included among your new releases, and I'd particularly like to play Opus 2 No. 3, because it's one of my favorites.
Mine too, actually.
But it's also a long sonata, and if we're going to play it, we've got to do it right now.
I will not say another word. I won't even tell you how many splices are in it.
Okay, I'll just have time to count them as they go through. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
And without further ado, the sonata in C major, Opus 2 No. 3 by Beethoven, played by Glenn Gould. That was the sonata in C major, Opus 2 No. 3 by Beethoven, performed by today's guest on Mostly Music, Glenn Gould. And that performance is from one of 6 soon-to-be-released CBS records celebrating Glenn Gould's 25th anniversary with that company. Tomorrow, the final program of the CBC's invitation series for conductors, with Dwight Bennett conducting the CBC Vancouver Orchestra. Mostly Music's studio production was by Bob Bauer, with technical operations by Steve Starchev. Production assistant is Cynthia Callard. Executive producer is Jane Forner. I'm Barclay McMillan. See you tomorrow.